Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and please forgive me. I'm grateful for Swinburne for having me over, and I'd like to thank Ramon in particular for making this happen. What I'm going to do today is really make the case about how piracy, which is once seen as something marginal, has now moved to the center stage of the cultural politics of our time. If you like, there's a kind of secret script in piracy, which is now unrevealing itself worldwide. So the argument I'm going to make is really provide a kind of map which starts from the debates on informality, move on to the context of piracy. I'm not going to go into the details of piracy, just a little bit, and then link it up to the current debates around Wikileaks. So piracy in this presentation is a kind of investment in the relationship of media and modernity in general, and our lives in general. So it will not be an exaggeration to suggest that media has emerged in India and other post-colonial societies as the authoritative cultural archive, spanning television, radio, print, digital culture, sound culture. The zone that is designated as the media emerges in contemporary references to political and cultural events, scandal, globalization, the economy, and consumption. The media is seen as the truth or falsehood filter through which the past and present are mobilized. A remarkable change from earlier decades where similar claims could not be voiced anywhere in the post-colonial world. Impossible. Now, the effects of media are both denounced as well as sought after by consumer groups, politicians, and public culture in general. So in this sense, India, the post-colonial world, seems no different from the rest of the world. In a remarkable loop, media becomes a source of news about its own effects, sting operations, piracy fears, the erosions of concepts of public and private as increasing sections of the population use media gadgets and become media producers. At a time of global turbulence, from Egypt to China to Wikileaks, media is often phantasmatically designated as both the cause as well as the stabilizing factor in this instability. So this, in a sense, is the media map of our time. Informality and its link to piracy offers us a very interesting vantage point from where we can view this problematic. What was once viewed as a very narrowly economic model has now exceeded itself very, very rapidly from the 1980s and formed new cultural political connections. So what I'm trying to say is there are unintended interfaces between the street pirate in Lagos, the peer-to-peer downloader in Melbourne, the hacker in Berlin, the whole new world of social media networking. Similarly, anxieties about piracy that really come to a peak in the last 15 years have now moved on to a general anxiety about the safety of information in general that pervade all forms of power. So the argument is, what was seen as part of a small world of informality moved on to piracy, and then what was seen as part of piracy has moved on to a larger realm, right? Let me start with the post-colonial world, because that is where I work, that is the world I know very well, and that is the vantage point through which I'm positioning my argument. The last 2 decades has seen the massive proliferation of media infrastructures in India and many post-colonial societies. These include large media industries like those of television and cinema, as well as thousands of informal sites like bazaars, small video cinemas, cable networks run by local cable operators. A typical example is my home. I get cable from a neighborhood kid who wired up the area 15 years ago. I don't get it from a large company. Along with this, around 700 million Indians have cellular phones that now produce text, video, digital images. more people have come through mass photography in India through the phone than the camera. So what you have is a massive expansion of a kind of media infrastructure. After the cellular phone, a growing section of the population is now the source of new media produced. That in turn links to new social networks, mainstream television through citizen journalism, peer-to-peer exchanges of text, music, video. The cellular phone has become a transmitter and media production device. Activists capture police brutality and protests. Ordinary people enter mass photography and share it with their friends, right? Now, the sudden expansion, 15 years really, this massive expansion in India, Africa, Latin America have all gone through this shift, have really thrown older control regimes into complete disarray. So in a situation of media porosity, the information leak from the state seems widespread. Leaked audio surveillance, secret documents. I mean, we're not just talking of Wikileaks, it's happening almost every day in India and many countries. They constantly feed into the idea of the media event. So what I'm trying to say is from the domain of media informality, piracy now seems to connect to the practices of Web 2.0 and social media. And as a parallel, anxieties about piracy seem to be projected onto regime anxieties about information in general. Now, if you go back to the old debates on informality, a category like informality was so-called discovered by ILO economists in the 1970s. In the 1960s, in a frenzy of modernization theory, it was commonly believed that economies operated within a model of dualism. And this is a kind of crude rendition, right? So, dualism is a modern efficient economy, an inefficient economy dominated by petty commodity production, small agriculture. So modernization meant movement from traditional to modern. By the 1970s, modernization theory was in complete ruins. At this time, a group of economists from the ILO went to Kenya and discovered that in the midst of economic crisis, there were actually very few unemployed. And to their utter surprise, they realized that not only were people working, they were working on the streets, they were opening shops. This was actually quite creative. So at this time, suddenly, this term came across. It's an economic term called informality. The World Bank started pushing it. And it started moving into economic debates all over the world, right? I'm going to examine this zone from 3 vantage points, rather than giving you an overall map from 3 vantage points. One vantage point is that of infrastructure, media infrastructure. The second vantage point is that of transnationalism. That is where we go into the crux of the story, transnationalism. And the third, which is where I come to social media, is the problem of media experience in general. That is, what does informality to piracy do to media experience in general? What are infrastructures? Infrastructures are really technical cultural constellations that embed populations, they provide connections in time and space. Now, media infrastructures include apparatus of production, distribution, broadcast, formal, informal, media industry, state control, pirate networks. All this is media infrastructure. Media infrastructures are typically connected to technological infrastructures of electricity, communication. Now, in post-colonial context, media infrastructures typically refract through affective economies. That is, they escape from control. Electricity is bypassed, media networks are bypassed, you move through informal networks. Further, infrastructures have lives. This is a beautiful phrase that Arjuna Padurai formulates. They have lives, some die, some move forward. In post-colonial contexts, populations extend lives. So you have things like dead media. Certain technologies die in the West. In post-colonial context, these things are constantly extended. People assemble, repair, extend life. Now, in the 1950s and the 1960s, media infrastructures in India and many post-colonial countries were part of the whole developmentalist armory of the regime. You had something called media that the state controlled. You had radio, you had television, you had a film industry that went through censorship. You had a whole model of national accumulation. Television and radio were typically pedagogic. These are things that gave education. Film that produced entertainment had to go through censorship, right? Now, from the 1980s, this whole model suddenly started moving into a turbulent zone. What is the context? The context is really twofold. First is the global crisis of 1968 to 1973 and the rise of the newly industrialized countries and East Asia, and the shift which has reached a peak today of production structures from the core Western countries to other countries, newer sites of capitalism. Now, this radical transformation of the world's economic geography and production structures, I think, fundamentally undermined the old analog-based industrial structure of US media industry. The first sign of this decline was the introduction of the VHS player in the 1970s. What the VHS player did was actually intimate many of these new geographies of informality and media piracy. Now, what the VHS player put in forth was a geography that was completely indifferent to national borders. New sites, new connections emerged. State-controlled exhibition was fundamentally disrupted. Censorship was disrupted. Media industries went into turbulence. So exhibitors, cinema houses, national control were destabilized as millions of people flocked to the VHS experience in private homes, pirate video halls, video clubs. When I was growing up as a student in India, I used to see these mushrooming everywhere, completely free of state control, which evaded the old model. Nowhere is this clearer in the countries of the South. So piracy, for me at least, through my own memory, came into public view with the VHS player. And the VHS player, from the moment it came to India, moved into this radical form of publicity. It was never a purely private experience, right? So video also intimated, in terms of media infrastructure, the arrival of the informal into media. So it produced an entirely new infrastructure. The video hall is a typical model. Connections of electricity, new forms of cable, new small-scale forms of production. Now, it's an entirely new infrastructure, and it drew on older infrastructure. Older monopolies like HMV, which is the music monopoly, completely crumbled. The music industry, the old monopolies were gone. A whole generation of singers came up with this. So infrastructure is constantly drawing from new affective economies, and it's opening up a whole new zone, which is indifferent to models of sovereignty. So what it actually intimated and pushed in is a new form of materiality. A cassette culture with audio cassettes, where thousands, in fact millions of people started touching media objects, exchanging media objects, small factories that started assembling them, a whole host of new singers that could produce them, right? So it's a kind of materiality that used to be controlled and filtered through the state or through corporations. And suddenly the zone was in public view. People saw it. Now, the second side that I think piracy transforms is that of the transnational. More than 15 years ago, Arjun Appadurai suggested that globalization is marked by a series of disjunctures rather than a homogenizing coherence. Now, Appadurai says that the contemporary intimated by globalization was disorganized. That is, it possesses no Euclidean boundaries, structures, or regularities. Now, if you read Appadurai's essay, it has a kind of manifesto-like quality, deliberate manifesto-like quality, like many academic essays that do these things. So what it does is actually quite useful. It adds media flows into a kind of disorganized global space, captured through his concept of media space. Media globalization definitely expanded these new cultural flows, and it's quite integral to our story. So it's not just between diasporas and home country, which is what Appadurai talks about, but between a series of elsewheres. Appadurai calls these other spaces elsewheres, and it's the elsewheres that is the core of my story. The crucial point in the new transnational story is national sovereignty as a model of managing media becomes inoperable, absolutely inoperable. It still works to some extent through forms of regulation, but through a kind of overwhelming model of managing media which was central to the 50s and 60s becomes inoperable. So I just want to show you one image. Can we have the image, please? Sorry. Okay, sorry. Now, this is something that comes later, and it's black and white. I apologize. The colors are quite nice. This is a kind of modal form of the media object that comes in with transnational media informality. It's a pirate DVD. And in the cassette era, there were similar connections. Now, when VHS began, the way VHS piracy operated in India was that the industry hated the VHS. So the industry would not allow the VHS in India. So what people would do is smuggle it from London. So the master would be smuggled from London, and copies would be made in India. So from the moment piracy emerged, it emerged transnationally. It came from Dubai or London. Now this is made by a Pakistani factory, right here. This is a Pakistani factory, Sadaf. Very big Pakistani factory in Karachi's Rainbow Center that I was lucky to visit. Now, this is a collection of 4 films, which is again a modal form of piracy globally, all over the post-colonial world, and I'm sure you'll find it in Melbourne, in Chinatown, wherever, collections, assembly of different forms. It's a kind of modal form, right? Now, it mimics a certain design of the global. And what it does is, it works on a crucial 24 to 48 hour cycle. When the master's released, the film is exhibited in Dubai, someone makes the camera copy, it goes by broadband to the Sadaf factory in Karachi, then the next 24 hours it comes to India. Very quickly. And this is absolutely typical. So what I'm trying to say is, for piracy, transnationalism was not something that is added or over, it was constitutive. And you have to understand, when this massive expansion of media infrastructures takes place in the post-colonial world, we're not talking of just another layer added to the social. We are talking of something constitutive with hundreds of millions of people getting involved. It undermined national sovereignty than ever before. Ever before. It's not just a regime change, it's a fundamental cultural change. So 48 hours, this would come to my local cable very quickly, and I would see it. If the film is released on Friday, Sunday night, I would be watching it, the camera copy, on my television set, right? But apart from this, very interesting new connections, elsewheres emerged. What are we talking about? New South-South geographies. Brian Larkin's wonderful book on media infrastructures and piracy in Nigeria, a particularly important section is on Hindi cinema in Africa. By disanchoring Hindi cinema from its traditional comparative model, Larkin's essay takes us into the place of Hindi cinema into local Hausa culture in northern Nigeria. Here, films from Nigeria and India move into this kind of intersection. So Hindi cinema moves through video, pirate video, copies are made, versions are made. So low-cost infrastructures of piracy that allowed this to to be made actually were typical of the entire post-colonial world. The emergence of China, and this is a very important part of the story, as a very important low-cost industrial hub of digital hardware outside Western hegemony, actually transforms the story as hardware moved between Taiwan, China, Southeast Asia, India, Africa, and Latin America. This is one country most sections of the world working class know. Whenever I travel, there's one country everyone knows, China. Precisely because of this flow of commodities. Elites may talk of the US, but China is something most of the poor know because their commodities come from there. Chinese phones, Chinese VCDs. It's a kind of cult, it's a word in India. There are markets in India which are called China markets, where the poor go and shop, right? Abu Malik Samon speaks of the movement of African traders to China to source electronic and other commodities. Similar stories can be repeated from India. In the 1980s, a once pirate media company, T-Series, pioneered the India-East Asia connection. And today, small traders from India go regularly to China to procure electronic commodities. Transnational flows of pirate cinema and music outside the East-West model are prevalent since the 1980s. Korean soap operas in Southeast Asia, in India, Hong Kong action films in Asia and Africa, Tamil cinema in Japan. The entire avant-garde, cinematic avant-garde in India is impossible without this flow of pirate cinema. Impossible. So, what you have is a fundamental cultural shift of the economic geography, a transformation of the old model of the social and the cultural, where the state was supposed to manage the cultural, and a disembedding of the old model of sovereignty. This is what piracy does. And I'm not just talking of what is legal, what is non-legal. I'm talking of the long-term consequences. Now, peer-to-peer networks of media circulation bypassed many of the authorized filters that controlled media, governments, media industries, and the international copyright regimes. As Joe's presentation pointed out, there have been periodic efforts to control this through anti-piracy and anti-counterfeiting campaigns. But these networks show no sign of disappearance. The vast expansion of the production of media commodities to Asia in the past 2 decades and the turbulence of the speculative economies of the 1990s that drew millions into this cycle of money, consumption, mediatization, and the 1990s is fairly crucial, offer us today an image of a fundamentally changed and mediatized world. Media goods are produced in China, as I said. Low-cost infrastructure, cameras, VCRs, mobile phones have spread all over the world to the so-called periphery of world capitalism through bazaar networks, traders, etc., etc. Older models of control have melted away. Now, significant parts of the poor now have some form of media infrastructure or connect to some form of media infrastructure. And the phone, remember, is not just for speaking. It's for photographing and taking video. So it's a kind of interface. So this is a huge shift of the geography. I want to go further. If this is what piracy has done, there's something more. The cultural political shift introduced by piracy, or the new informal mix, has been constitutive to our time in general. And this links up to what Stuart was saying. If we divide contemporary media of piracy into 3 phases, the video era, the VHS era of the 1980s, the digital storms of the 1990s, and then now the new phase, where the world of piracy meets the world of social media. I want to talk of one incident that happened in India recently, and it sort of intimates a kind of moment. Most of you know of the political turmoil in Kashmir in India. Indian police in Kashmir spend a lot of their time monitoring Facebook accounts of Kashmiri youth who are using posts as a tool to source information about activists. So a lot of the traditional networks of gathering information have sort of melted away. So Facebook has now become a very important context. So in a context where text messaging and newspapers are put on hold after protests, Facebook posts and YouTube uploads have emerged as similar options. India is one of the fastest growing Facebook using country. And this is poor society, bad infrastructure, but extremely fast. Massive YouTube growing population, right? Now, both, I think, provide a clear challenge to the ruling establishment in India, whose post-1947 model of managing culture has been significantly disoriented from the 1980s onward. And it's just not true of India, it's true of most countries in the world. Sovereignty, clearly legible in the old model of stable media production and distribution, is now questioned on a daily basis worldwide. So the viral world of piracy and media transmission affects all, politicians included, and case law, and the whole body of case law is just struggling to deal with it. For policymakers in general, the coming of new media, I think, offers legal and regulatory complications. When older divisions between producer and consumer get constantly blurred, and they're blurring every day. Who's the producer? Who's the consumer? As people produce media, ordinary people produce media. Now, Gilles Deleuze once suggested before he died that we've moved from a society of control to a society of modulation. That is, society of control with stable signs, are gone. To the new society of modulation is a kind of post-media realm of filters. You no longer have the old model of control, you have filters. You have regimes, you have rebels in a kind of permanent state of war. And all regimes do is set up new filters. They can't control as they controlled in the old model. I think, but media piracy has focused on two core aspects of the current global system. In this sense, I'm speaking on a world scale. First, the world is embedded in a media ecology that is central to our lives. And this we know, this is a fact. I mean, I don't even have to argue this. We are all media practitioners now. In some way where we write, we photograph, we share, reproduce, and connect. Permanent online connectivity in the West. But the current global regime was not designed to acknowledge this. Absolutely not. It is not designed to acknowledge this. State power and state theory was not designed to embed itself in this media ecology. The whole system of law was not designed to do this. So there's a huge crisis now. States, paradoxically, are even more dependent than ever before on information systems and digital media for economic modernization and war. And this shift, I think, renders them vulnerable in a daily basis. The vast security apparatus, and it's fairly vast, cannot protect constant leaks in the system. I mean, we're not just talking of the US and the Wikileaks. We're talking of the social security data in the UK coming out. It could be any country. So you have a shift in the media ecology, a desire for information, and somewhere the control system seems not to be working. Now, these leaks can come from anywhere. Personal digital images taken by jailers and soldiers. So torturers also photograph, as we know. So it's a kind of frenzy of producing the moment. A lot of these videos have come from torturers. Abu Ghraib, in a sense, is the allegory of our time, right? Facebook updates by government officers, which expose them. Dissident soldiers copying vast data sets online, as in the Wikileaks case. So in technologized populations, and this is what piracy intimates, endless circulation is the engine of the contemporary. Piracy is a crucial, absolutely crucial component of this media ecology. It doesn't exhaust it, but it intimates it. And its mass following is puzzling only to those who don't recognize that we are in the midst of a constitutive shift in terms of a contemporary world. The second part of media piracy has been its attention, and this is the very interesting crux of the report that Joe talked about, attention to the iniquities of the global knowledge system. I mean, it's ruled by an intellectual property regime that's more restrictive every day, limits on fair use, criminalization of sharing of digital media and rights management, and the aggressive push of the media industry that's continuing every day. Now, the big problem, at least for me living in Delhi, for the US media industry, is that the US power in the world economy is on secular decline. At least that's what I feel. It's on secular decline. We don't know what's going to happen in the next 20, 30 years. And the current regime of control lacks a long-term guarantor. So the criticisms of the intellectual property regime, I think, have come to a climax, and it's just right for a full-time reappraisal. But I would say the conceptual move we need to make, and this is what media after informality leads to, the conceptual move we need to make is fairly more fundamental. The 19th century saw important, powerful theoretical moves in the human sciences to stabilize global modernity. Interpretive frameworks for the management of populations conceptually differentiated humans from machines, natural science from culture, leisure from work. Very important innovations in the 19th century. For the most purposes, today, the architecture of the social has persisted. That is the separation of the social and the medial. I think today's media ecologies illuminate the limit of this framework. Somewhere, the engine of the 19th century has either come to a stop or run aground. Today's media ecology shows that 19th century separations of nature from culture are routinely violated by both states and populations worldwide. To conclude, I would say Bruno Latour, the well-known philosopher of science, has been calling for a reassembling of the 19th century model. I think this is a very good time to heed his call. Thank you.